So my fear, in fact, is that if the emerging market economies, especially the large ones like China, cannot pull it together and create a domestically sustainable recovery driven by domestic demand, we could end up with this problem being exacerbated. Now, of course, many of the major countries, the US included, have been talking about the medium term. But it is one thing to talk about the medium term, but another thing to get there. And I fear that that is one thing that we'll have to keep our eye on. And here, whether the IMF can actually play an effective role in terms of trying to diffuse the macroeconomic imbalance situation, I think is a very important issue. The other issue that the IMF faces, of course, is another ironical one in terms of the symmetry of the advice it is giving to countries. The US is in a desperate situation. China is in a not quite desperate, but still in a difficult situation. And so is the case for other emerging markets. And the IMF, I think, is correctly arguing that they should be using conventional in terms of monetary and fiscal policies. And yet when one reads this paper that the IMF has put out, one senses a tension there in terms of telling these low-income countries a slightly different message, that they shouldn't be too aggressive on fiscal policy, that they shouldn't be too aggressive on monetary policy. Now, this inconsistency, of course, is because of the way things are. Life ain't fair. And the fact is that a country like the US or China has much more resources to be able to use these policies much more effectively. And these low-income countries, which are much more dependent on the rest of the world for their very survival in some cases, are not going to be able to take such effective policies. But from the IMF's point of view, I think getting this nuance in the message across is going to be a really challenging task, because the obvious question can arise, and it has arisen, why there is this apparent asymmetry of advice being given to the rich countries which followed a particular growth model, which ended up in some ways not seeming to work very well. And essentially, we are allowing the rich countries which fomented the crisis to, in fact, encouraging them to undertake unconventional policies while we are trying to stick with what one might think of as IMF orthodoxy for the low-income countries.